The war did not begin with a missile strike. It did not begin with a declaration from the podium of the White House or the Supreme Leader's office in Tehran. It began in the silence between the headlines, in the quiet accumulation of grievances, in the slow, tectonic shifting of power that no one wanted to acknowledge until the ground finally cracked open. In 2024, I told you that the status quo was an illusion. I told you that the containment strategy was dead, that the diplomatic off-ramps had been paved over by hubris and miscalculation, and that the Middle East was sleepwalking into a conflict that would redefine the global order. At the time, many called it alarmist. They said the region was stabilizing. They pointed to the Abraham Accords, to the tentative dialogues between Riyadh and Tehran, to the fatigue of war in the American psyche. They were wrong. They were looking at the surface of the water while ignoring the storm brewing beneath. Now, in April 2026, we are living in the aftermath of that prediction. The conflict is here, but it is not the war you expected. It is not World War I. It is not a nuclear apocalypse. It is something far more complex, far more insidious, and far more difficult to end. It is a war of attrition, of shadows, of economic strangulation, and of psychological endurance. And today, I am not just going to tell you what is happening. I am going to tell you how it ends. Because wars do not go on forever. They exhaust themselves. They reach a point of diminishing returns where the cost of continuing exceeds the value of victory. We are approaching that point now. But the path to the endgame is fraught with danger. One wrong step, one miscalculated strike, one moment of panic could escalate this limited conflict into a regional inferno. To understand how it ends, we must first understand exactly what this war is, why it started, and who is really fighting it. Let us strip away the noise. Turn off the news ticker. Forget the moralizing rhetoric about good and evil. This is not a crusade. This is not a clash of civilizations. This is a raw, brutal struggle for hegemony in the most strategic region on Earth. The United States entered this phase of the conflict not because it wanted to, but because it felt it had no choice. The attacks on its bases in Iraq and Syria, the harassment of shipping in the Red Sea, the relentless pressure on Israel, these were not isolated incidents. They were the symptoms of a single, coordinated strategy by Iran and its axis to push the United States out of the Middle East. Washington's response was not driven by a desire for conquest, but by a fear of irrelevance. If the U.S. could not protect its allies, if it could not keep the sea lanes open, if it could not deter its adversaries, then its guarantee meant nothing. And if its guarantee meant nothing, then the entire post-1945 global order would unravel. So the U.S. struck back, not with invasion forces, but with air power, with cyber warfare, with intensified sanctions, with diplomatic isolation. And Iran responded in kind, not with direct confrontation, but with asymmetric escalation. Missile drills, proxy attacks, nuclear advancements. The cycle spun faster and faster until the breakage occurred. But to predict the end, we must look deeper than the current exchanges of fire. We must look at the structural realities that constrain both sides. This is where the true analysis begins. Most commentators focus on the tactics, the type of drone used, the range of the missile, the specific target struck. This is a mistake. Tactics change. Strategy is constant. And the strategy of both the United States and Iran is defined by limitation. The United States is limited by its domestic politics, its economic debt, and its strategic pivot to Asia. It cannot afford a long, costly war in the Middle East. The American public has no appetite for it. The Congress is divided. The economy is fragile. Every dollar spent on a Tomahawk missile is a dollar not spent on infrastructure at home or on countering China in the Pacific. This is the primary constraint on American power. It is not military capability. It is political will and economic sustainability. Iran, conversely, is limited by its economic fragility and its internal legitimacy. The regime is surviving, but it is not thriving. Sanctions have bitten deep. Inflation is rampant. The younger generation is disillusioned. The regime's legitimacy rests on two pillars: revolutionary ideology and national security. If it fails to provide security, if it allows the country to be bombed with impunity, it loses its raison d'etre. If it fails to provide economic stability, It loses the support of the masses. It is walking a tightrope. It needs to project strength without triggering a full-scale invasion that IT needs to resist without collapsing the economy. This is the primary constraint on Iranian power. It is not military weakness, it is regime survival. These constraints create a paradox. Both sides want to de-escalate, but neither can afford to look weak. Both sides are trapped in a logic of escalation. If the US pulls back, it looks weak, and Iran emboldens its proxies. If Iran backs down, it looks weak, and its proxies lose faith, and its domestic opponents smell blood. So they continue to dance on the edge of the abyss. This is the escalation trap, and it is the defining feature of this conflict. To predict how it ends, we must identify the mechanism that breaks this trap. History tells us there are only three ways an escalation trap ends: mutual exhaustion, external intervention, or catastrophic collapse. Let us analyze each. Mutual exhaustion is the most likely outcome, but it is also the most painful. It involves a long, grinding period of low-intensity conflict that drains both sides until they simply stop. Think of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. 8 years of stalemate, hundreds of thousands of dead, and no clear winner. Eventually, both sides were too broke and too battered to continue. They accepted a ceasefire not because they wanted peace, but because they could not afford war. We are seeing echoes of this today. The US is draining its munition stockpiles. Iran is draining its financial reserves. The Gulf states are draining their patience. But unlike the 1980s, the global economy is interconnected. A prolonged conflict disrupts supply chains, spikes energy prices, and fuels inflation worldwide. The international community will not allow this to drag on for 8 years. The pressure for a resolution will mount quickly. This suggests that mutual exhaustion will be accelerated by external factors. External intervention is the second possibility. Who are the external actors? China and Russia. China is the biggest buyer of Iranian oil. It has a vested interest in stability. It does not want a war that disrupts its energy supplies or expands US influence. Russia is a military partner of Iran, supplying drones and technical expertise that IT benefits from the distraction of the US in the Middle East, but it also fears a chaotic collapse that could spill over into its own sphere of influence. Both China and Russia have been playing a double game. They support Iran rhetorically and materially, but they have also been engaging in back-channel diplomacy with the US and the Gulf states. They want a managed conflict, not an uncontrolled explosion. As the war drags on, their role will shift from enablers to mediators. They will push for a freeze in hostilities, not a permanent peace. They will offer Iran economic lifelines in exchange for restraint. They will offer the US a face-saving exit in exchange for de-escalation. This is the great power brokerage scenario. It is cynical, it is realpolitik, and it is highly probable. Catastrophic collapse is the third possibility and the one we must avoid at all costs. This happens if one side miscalculates. If an Iranian missile hits a populated area in Tel Aviv or Dubai, killing hundreds. If a US strike accidentally hits a nuclear facility, causing radiation leaks. If an internal uprising in Iran topples the regime, creating a power vacuum. These events would shatter the constraints. They would force a total war. The US would be compelled to invade. Iran would be compelled to fight to the death. The region would burn. This is the nightmare scenario. It is unlikely because both sides are rational actors who understand the stakes. But rationality can break down under stress. The fog of war is thick. The risk of accident is high. This is why the next few months are critical. The margin for error is zero. So how does it end? My prediction is a hybrid of the first two scenarios. The war will end through a process of managed de-escalation brokered by China and Russia, driven by mutual exhaustion, and formalized in a series of unofficial, non-binding agreements. There will be no grand treaty signed in Geneva. There will be no handshake between the US president and the Iranian supreme leader. That is theater for a different era. Instead, there will be a quiet understanding, a cessation of direct attacks, a scaling back of proxy activities, a loosening of certain sanctions in exchange for nuclear limits, a return to the status quo ante, but with new lines of control drawn in the sand. Let us break this down step by step. The first phase of the endgame is already underway. They freeze. Both sides will announce a unilateral pause in offensive operations. The U.S. will halt its airstrikes on Iranian-backed militias. Iran will order its proxies to cease attacks on U.S. bases and shipping. This will be framed not as a concession, but as a humanitarian pause or a strategic review. It will be a face-saving measure. The media will call it a ceasefire. The insiders will call it a breathing space. During this freeze, the back-channel negotiations will intensify. Oman, Qatar, and Switzerland will serve as conduits. Beijing and Moscow will apply pressure. The Gulf states will offer incentives. The second phase is the economic bargain. Iran is desperate for relief. It needs access to the global financial system. It needs to sell its oil openly. The U.S. cannot lift all sanctions. That would be political suicide. But it can offer waivers. It can allow certain countries to buy Iranian oil without penalty. It can release frozen assets in exchange for verified steps on the nuclear program. This is not a deal. It is a transaction. Iran gets cash. The U.S. gets compliance. It is ugly, but it works. This phase will be controversial. Critics in Washington will call it appeasement. Hardliners in Tehran will call it betrayal. But the pragmatic centers of power in both capitals will override them. Why? Because the alternative is worse. The third phase is the security architecture. This is the most difficult part. The U.S. cannot leave the region entirely, but it cannot stay in its current form. It will shift to an over-the-horizon posture. Fewer troops, more drones, more intelligence sharing with local partners. The Gulf states will be encouraged to build their own defense capabilities. They will buy more weapons from the U.S., Europe, and even China. They will form a loose regional security forum that includes Iran. This is not a NATO-style alliance. It is a dialogue mechanism, a way to manage crises before they explode. Iran will be invited to the table, not as an equal, but as a stakeholder. It will be a humbling experience for Tehran, but it will also be a recognition of its reality. You cannot ignore a country that controls the Strait of Hormuz. This endgame will not satisfy anyone. The hawks in Washington will feel betrayed. The revolutionaries in Tehran will feel compromised. The Israelis will feel abandoned. The Palestinians will feel forgotten. But peace is not about satisfaction. It is about stability. It is about stopping the bleeding. And in this case, the bleeding must stop. The global economy cannot withstand another shock. The American political system cannot withstand another forever war. The Iranian regime cannot withstand another year of isolation. The stars are aligned for a deal. Not a good deal. Not a just deal, but a deal. However, there are spoilers. There are actors who benefit from chaos. Israel may attempt to sabotage the negotiations by conducting provocative strikes. Hardline factions within the IRGC may launch rogue attacks to derail the process. Terrorist groups like ISIS may exploit the lull to regroup and strike. The U.S. domestic political landscape is volatile that a change in administration could tear up any agreement. These risks are real. They are significant, but they are not insurmountable. The momentum for de-escalation is stronger than the momentum for war. The cost of war has become too visible, too tangible. The price of gas, the stock market volatility, the body bags, these are powerful motivators for peace. Let us look closer at the role of China in this endgame. This is the element that most Western analysts miss. China is not just a passive observer. It is an active architect of a new order. Beijing has learned from the U.S. mistakes. It does not try to impose its values. It does not try to regime change. It offers trade, infrastructure, and non-interference. This is attractive to the Middle Eastern states. They are tired of being lectured. They want to do business. China is positioning itself as the guarantor of energy security. It is mediating between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It is buying Iranian oil. It is investing in Iraqi reconstruction. In the endgame of this war, China will be the bankroller. It will provide the economic incentives that make peace profitable. The U.S. will provide the security guarantees that make peace safe. This is a division of labor that neither side likes, but both will accept. It is the birth of a dual hegemony in the Middle East. The U.S. holds the gun. China holds the checkbook. and the region learns to live with both. What does this mean for the global order? It means the end of American exceptionalism in the Middle East. The U.S. is no longer the sole arbiter. It is one player among many. This is a profound shift. For 70 years, the U.S. dictated the terms. Now, it must negotiate. This is a decline in relative power, but not necessarily in absolute power. The U.S. remains the strongest military force, but it can no longer impose its will unilaterally. This is a lesson that will apply to other regions as well. In Europe, in Asia, in Africa, the U.S. will find itself having to share influence. The unipolar moment is over. The multipolar reality is here, and Iran is the testing ground. If the U.S. can manage a graceful exit in Iran, it can manage its global transition. If it fails, if it gets dragged into a quagmire, it will accelerate its decline. For Iran, this endgame represents a Pyrrhic victory. It will survive. It will retain its nuclear latency. It will maintain its proxy network. But it will remain isolated from the West. It will remain dependent on China and Russia. It will not achieve its dream of regional dominance. That it will be contained, not by military force, but by economic and diplomatic encirclement. The regime will claim victory to its domestic audience. It will say it defeated the great Satan. But the people will know the truth. They will see the continued poverty, the continued repression, the continued lack of freedom. The war will have preserved the regime, but it will not have saved the nation. The disconnect between the state and the society will widen. This is the long-term threat to the Islamic Republic. Not external enemies, but internal decay. For the people of the Middle East, this endgame offers a respite, not a solution. The underlying tensions remain. The sectarian divides, the economic inequality, the political authoritarianism. These are not addressed by a ceasefire. They are merely paused. The war will end, but the peace will be cold. It will be a peace of armed truce, not of reconciliation. But in a region that has known only fire, a cold peace is a blessing. It allows for rebuilding. It allows for trade. It allows for life to return to normal. And that is enough for now. So, here is the final prediction. By late 2027, the active combat phase of this war will be over. The headlines will shift. The urgency will fade. The world will move on to the next crisis. But the scars will remain. The Middle East will be different. More fragmented. More aligned with Asia. Less dependent on the West. The U.S. will be present, but distant. Iran will be contained, but resilient. And the world will have learned a hard lesson. That you cannot bomb your way to stability. That you cannot sanction your way to compliance. That power has limits. And that the only way out of the escalation trap is to stop climbing. This is not a happy ending. It is not a triumphant one. It is a realistic one. It is the ending that history demands. The empires of the past failed in Iran because they tried to conquer it. The United States will not fail if it learns to coexist with it. The war ends not with a bang, but with a whisper. A quiet agreement in a smoke-filled room in Muscat. A signed paper in Beijing. A withdrawal of carriers from the Gulf. And life, stubborn and resilient, goes on. As you watch the news in the coming months, look for the signs. Look for the pauses in rhetoric. Look for the secret meetings. Look for the economic waivers. Do not be distracted by the occasional flare-up. That is noise. The signal is the slow, steady movement toward de-escalation. The war is ending, not because anyone won, but because everyone lost. And in the geopolitics of the Middle East, that is the only way peace ever comes. This analysis is not just about Iran. It is about the nature of power in the 21st century. It is about the limits of military force. It is about the rise of economic statecraft. And it is about the inevitable shift from unipolarity to multipolarity. The U.S. is not falling. It is adapting. Iran is not rising. It is surviving. And the world is not ending. It is changing. And those who understand the change will thrive. Those who cling to the past will be left behind. The war is ending. The future is beginning. And it looks nothing like the past. Remember this. The most dangerous moment in any conflict is not the beginning, but the end. When the adrenaline fades, when the calculations shift, when the spoilers make their move. We are entering that moment now. Watch closely. The details matter. The devil is in the details. And the future of the world is being written in those details. Do not look away.